This hour, there are hundreds of thousands of people here in Tiananmen Square, perhaps as many as 500,000, even more. In the history of communist China, there has never been anything like this.
On June 4th, 1989, hundreds of unarmed civilians were killed while participating in a pro-democracy protest led by local Chinese students in Tiananmen Square. For a current Chinese high school student, this event is practically non-existent. It was like the Tiananmen Square protests never happened. Any person trying to search for this event will only receive a message saying, "This page cannot be found," and is one of the many topics blocked by the Great Firewall of China. Governments must not restrict access to information so that citizens can have free thought. These restrictions on intellectual freedom can be seen in The Giver, as well as in many modern-day societies. The novel The Giver by Lois Lowry describes a futuristic black and white society full of tranquility and harmony. The society lacks pain, war, and fear. At the age of 12, Jonas receives his lifetime job as the receiver, who holds the bad memories that occurred before this time of peace. He is given these memories by the giver, who currently holds them. The first memory he receives is the memory of riding down a bright red sled through the snow. Jonas's family takes care of a newborn known as Gabriel, and when Jonas finds out that Gabriel is in danger of being released and discovers that this is death, he is frustrated and angered. Jonas plans to run away from society into elsewhere with Gabriel. He leaves with a supply of food on his father's bike into the night towards elsewhere. Gabriel and Jonas travel through a world of color and emotion to come across a bright red sled at the top of a hill and a town full of singing people. Lois Lowry argues against the restriction of information and intellectual freedom, specifically in memories and emotions in the novel The Giver. The Giver uses his wisdom and the memories in order to advise the elders on how to make decisions. He knows that, quote, "There had been times in the past, terrible times, when people had destroyed others in haste, in fear, and had brought about their own destruction," end quote. Wisdom is knowledge, and having the wisdom about past experiences allows people not to repeat their mistakes and repeat history. Therefore, not having wisdom means not having knowledge, and this means a society cannot grow and develop and fix their problems. When the giver provides wisdom to the elders, he says, quote, "There are so many things I could tell them, things I wish they would change, but they don't want to change," end quote. This restriction of information dooms history to repeat itself. Without knowing mistakes, societies are unable to learn and better themselves, which can lead to underdeveloped and unadvanced societies. As the times change, societies must adapt to stay modern and advanced. Without the desire or knowledge of change, societies can stay the same, which hurts people and can lead to consequences such as hunger and war. These ideas on the restriction of intellectual freedom can also be seen in many modern-day societies. In Belarus, the people and press had their freedoms, but the new regime is cracking down on unreliable sources and opposition statements. According to the article, "Why is Belarus cracking down on independent journalists?" the country has begun to restrict, quote, "the spread of alternative information," end quote, and opposition propaganda right before the upcoming 2020 election in order to keep power. The government has also begun to crack down on anonymous comments on the internet and restricts comments the government decides are, quote, "in violation of existing laws," end quote. By restricting opposition to the government keeps power over what is said about them and makes sure that they are only seen as good. This allows them to stay in power legally and create a powerful authoritarian regime and control the narrative of elections. The citizens are also not able to form their own opinions because they are only seeing one viewpoint, which is a restriction on democracy. Another example of the restriction of media can be seen in Turkey. The government has begun to impose fines on main media sources that control the majority of the spread of information. In the article, Turkish leaders' next target in the crackdown on dissent, the internet, it says that the country, quote, "encouraged loyal businessmen to take over publications and television channels," end quote. Even independent internet companies who share information through social media would be required to be licensed. These regulations also, quote, "halt live streaming and fine companies over content," end quote. These restrictions on media allow the government to control the narrative and regulate what information gets out to the public, not only inside the country, but outside the country as well. This restricts freedom of speech and opinion because without the knowledge of multiple opinions and different viewpoints, citizens are unable to find reasons to oppose the government. This allows the government to stay in power and build an authoritarian regime. In China, the information given to the citizens and the world is restricted, which restricts knowledge. The role of media in China has a much different role than many democratic societies. According to the article, Media Control in China, instead of allowing free speech and press, the government, quote, exercises tight control over public opinion, end quote, allowing no criticism of the government and no power to the media to act as a watchdog over the government. China has limited people's access to public discussion on the internet and, quote, has imposed penalties to restrict journalists' freedom. By restricting government criticism and oppositionists, the government allows no collaboration between the citizens and government and no watchdog function by the media. This restricts changes made to the country and leaves countries stagnant because they cannot learn from their mistakes. This also ensures that the country is only getting the government-biased information rather than the truth, which can lead to political corruption. China also restricts the access to information through the internet by having a closed internet. According to the article, The Road to Internet Serfdom, the Chinese government uses the internet as, quote, tools for total government surveillance and control, quote, rather than a way to access information. The government, quote, systematically screens out access to any websites they deem harmful or undesirable, end quote, specifically Western world's content. The government restricts the access to the outside world, preventing any negative views of the government while also restricting access to information to any other country the citizens may deem as better, and allows the government to stay in control. By doing so, the government restricts the access to outside opinions they do not agree with, so that citizens cannot make informed decisions due to the lack of all viewpoints on the situation. This restricts their intellectual freedom as they cannot form their own opinions without access to unfiltered information. While the restriction of information restricts intellectual freedom, not all agree on free access to every piece of information. Some may argue that the restriction of information will prevent the spread of fake news and prevent lies from being spread. The spread of fake news creates confusion and punches holes in what is true and leaves the reader doubting everything, including real news. According to the article, does fake news pose a significant problem for democracy? This spread of fake news assaults the truthfulness of democracies and leaves the citizens questioning what is the truth. The opposition argues that by restricting the media to prevent the spread of fake news, the government protects the trust between the people and the government and prevents serious consequences such as conflicts with world leaders and other countries that could arise with the spread of fake news. Even though fake news may have negative consequences, the restriction of fake news also comes with negative consequences, such as the restriction of free speech and intellectual freedom. The government could begin to mark unpopular or opposition opinions as fake news, especially if fake news is not specifically defined in these regulations. The crackdown on fake news would also create a distrust between the government and the media, which could lead to mass protests or violence against the government. The restriction of information and intellectual freedom is very present in the novel The Giver as well as in today's society. In The Giver, memories are restricted to the public, while in modern-day countries, opposition to the government and other information is restricted. Citizens must fight for their freedom of press, speech, and intellectual freedom, and governments must not restrict this access to information in order to allow citizens to make informed decisions and protect their fundamental rights. Citizens should also vote for leaders that will not restrict these freedoms. By allowing intellectual freedom and the free access to information and different viewpoints, people can make informed decisions and the history books will not repeat themselves.